How's it going, everybody? I was out for a while, haven't been uploading the episodes on YouTube anymore. But that was just because I was diverting my energy to somewhere else, something else that took priority, I would say, over this. But wherever I'm not doing things on the front end, I'm always learning, absorbing that the back end is always solid. The learning process is always happening. So that way it's been going great. But I definitely, one thing that is never going to happen is that I'll never stop coming back. So I'll never, after these breaks, there will never be a point where I think, okay, I'm not going to do these videos anymore. I'm going to move on to something else, because I really like sitting down and breaking things apart, things that are related to exercise science. So specifically, because that's something that I'm interested in. So today we are talking about ACLs, and at what I always think about, at what capacity should I address these topics, because sometimes, whenever you're talking about things such as injuries, sometimes it might feel like that only doctors get to talk about these topics, physiotherapists get to talk about these topics. But as a fitness professional, I just think that first of all, it's let's just ask ourselves, why do we always think about injuries when we think about ACLs, right? So right off the bat, just because we talk about ACLs, it doesn't mean that we are addressing injuries. As fitness professionals, we got to understand that understanding what a ligament does, what kind of function a ligament has in movement and in your body, wherever they exist in whatever joints, understanding what they do, what role they play, it's a fundamental part of understanding movement, which is a part of understanding exercising, right? Which is a part of understanding how to use this whole thing, exercise, around which you have a certain amount of knowledge. Use this thing to help people grow or achieve goals, or essentially just achieve objectives that they or you, both of you, think they should, or you should, as an athlete, not just as a fitness professional. As an athlete, you should know what an ACL does, and that's what we're talking about. So I am addressing this topic, talking about ACL, to whoever is listening. First of all, as an athlete, because why I'm talking about this topic is because I was out on this run and I was just shredding this downhill segment of this trail, right? And it was a brutal run, I can say, because I've started training again. It's been 2 weeks into this fresh running training block, and this is usually the time when you really feel the stress of transitioning into it. Like, your body's under stress, it's under duress. So the day after that, when the soreness and everything settled in, I was taking a flight of stairs down, and I don't know, I was taking a flight of stairs somewhere, and my knees started feeling really wobbly. And just because I think about these things because I kind of have to. The work, the pursuit of learning, everything is structured around this. So obviously, when I experienced this for myself, that my knee is feeling wobbly, and I started thinking about, okay, this has definitely emerged out of my training the previous day, because I was definitely shredding the downhills and I was feeling the impact of it. So I got to thinking about, okay, how does this thing work? What am I really feeling? What could be at, what could I be really experiencing? You start reducing things, breaking it apart down to its fundamentals, and that's how I got started thinking about ACLs. And right, and coming back to the point, coming back to actually a couple of point, going back to a point that I made a couple of points ago, when I said, whenever we say ACLs, we think about injuries, and that's just because it's not injury. When you say ACL, you do not have to think about injury, and ACL is just a part. It's a ligament. It's a structure that exists around your joints. What do ligaments do? Ligaments are going to keep a joint's integrity intact. It is going to play a role in whatever the normal range of motion that the joint goes through in different kinds of movement. For example, whenever you're walking, if you talk about your knee, right, your shin bone is kind of dangling off the knee, beneath the knee. So whenever you're walking, the shin bone goes through a certain amount of rotation as well. Just as an example, let's say whenever I'm taking a step forward, the shin bone is going to, what does it do? It's going to internally rotate, right? And when I put my Wait, it's going to internally rotate or externally rotate? It's probably going to externally rotate. Then it's going to internally rotate when you plant your foot down, and when you take your foot off, it's going to externally rotate again. So it keeps going through these cycles of internal, external rotation. I might have messed up the sequence because it gets kind of hard to think about, right? Biomechanics is a little hard to think about whenever you try to put it into context of motion, and we are all just learning. But the gist of the matter is that different bones at different joints, they go through a certain range of motion, right? And and all you have to do is think about what would happen if there were no ligaments around the knee and there were no muscles around the knee. All you had were bones. Let's say whenever I'm walking, and since the knee joint is basically your femur and your tibia, right? Two bones, shin bone, thigh bone, and there's a patella in front of it, right? This is what it is, and everything else around this, it's just soft tissue, ligaments, tendons, and bones, sorry, and muscles holding that joint together, right? So whenever you're walking these bones essentially, they just articulate, right? They're never really intact, stuck with each other, right? They articulate. There's always some space between them, which is usually filled with all kinds of soft tissues, cartilage, padding, cushioning, right? These tissues that prevent kind of like the shock that goes whenever you're walking, doing anything. There's, your body is getting compressed. Let's say you put a foot down somewhere, your it's resistance, the ground is not moving, so there's force coming up, and there's, whenever you're walking, there's always a certain amount of compression expansion at every single joint going on, depending on what the movement is, right? So, and if these soft tissues didn't exist, and if I was just, let's say, if I was just walking forward, if I plant a foot down, right, my foot goes forward. Now what I'm doing is I'm putting my entire body weight on top of that leg. Let's say if soft tissues didn't exist, muscles, tendons, and ligaments didn't exist, then the bones would just slide off, right? The shin bone would just slide off. It wouldn't take the weight of the body. The muscles, bones, and the muscles, ligaments, and tendons, these soft tissue structures, the fascia around the joints, around the bones, is what maintains the integrity of you, the person, right? So that's what all ligaments do. So ACL is also going to do that. Now, depending on where the ligament is placed and what bones and bones and muscles what bones basically they're articulating with, interacting with, different ligaments will have different functions, will they not? Just as an example, ACL, anterior cruciate ligament, what it does is, see, whenever it prevents the anterior translation of the tibia. That's the heavy lifting. That's all the heavy lifting that you have to do around ACLs. If you ever thought that ACL is a difficult subject to understand, it's such a complex subject, it has got to do with sports injuries and whatnot. The only technicality you really need to know about ACL, what someone can throw at you and what you might not understand, is anterior translation of the tibia. What is this? What's the tibia? Tibia is the big shin bone, right? Whenever I'm walking, whenever I'm running, the shin bone goes, let's imagine the shin bone going through a degree of motion, right? A range. So that's me standing, that's me taking a step, right? This is my shin bone, this part is my shin bone, and when I take a step, and when I'm about to take that other step, right, this shin bone has now gone through a range of motion. It has turned a certain degrees, it has traveled forward a certain degrees, right? And then I just cycle back to another step. So this forward translation of the tibia, this is what the forward translation of the tibia is the shin bone going through a range of motion, turning forward, right? What we also call as a positive shin angle. So it's angling forward, right? The shin bone. So we can say, if we imagine the tibia in space, if we imagine the shin bone in space, whenever I'm taking a step and running, this forward translation of tibia is constantly happening, right? So if you just imagine the shin bone in space, it's traveling forward, right? It's translating forward. It's a straight movement forward. And what the ACL does is, this is what is ensuring that the tibia doesn't translate abnormally. It doesn't go out of what is the normal, range of motion of the joint. Because what will happen if the tibia just translates, abnormally? That's when you see those knee buckling episodes, where the ligament injuries, where the knee just gives out. What does it really mean that the knee gives out? It means that let's say in case of an ACL injury, the ACL's job is to hold that tension when that tibia is translating forward whenever, let's say, you're running, which is like a typical example of a forward translation of tibia. And the ACL is what is holding this back. And if it goes beyond the capacity of the ACL, and let's say the ACL snaps, then, and if the ACL snaps, then the tibia is just going to buckle forward. The shin is going to buckle forward, and it's going to compromise the integrity of the knee. Now, this is a full-blown ACL tear, but the ACL does get damaged as well in different, in different kinds of episodes, depending on what kind of strain it is sustaining. That's when you see those grade 1, 2, 3 degree strains, grade 1 through 1, 2, 3 degree tears are just ways of classifying how severely the ACL's functionality or ability is damaged, right? So that's how the ACL goes. That's one of the big things that the ACL does, is that it prevents the forward translation of tibia. Now, let's say the ACL is damaged. Let's say we are somebody who has a damaged ACL. We have some kind of ACL strain, recovering from an ACL injury or something like that. Right? That's your context. I can't really give you information around your own specific injury, because very similar to what we did here, we reduced everything down to its fundamentals. We'll have to do that same thing for your, you and your physiotherapist will have to do that same thing for your injury as well. So it's a very individualistic process. So none of this is injury advice. We are just breaking down and looking at what an ACL does. So hypothetically, let's say if there's a person that has a certain amount of damage in their ACL, then movements that involve this forward translation of tibia is going to be compromised. These movements are going to be compromised. Now let's think about, where do we really see, if you just imagine the shin bone in space in relation to human movement, where do we really see this forward translation of tibia? We see it obviously in walking, right? And also understand that the amount of stress that gets put on the ACL, right? We have a damaged ACL, we have movements where the tibia is going forward and backward, and the ACL is obviously getting involved. And since it is damaged and it is also getting involved, it might get overworked, or we might be working a tissue that probably needs rest, right? Overstraining a tissue that needs rest. So we need to know what movements to prevent, right? What movements to avoid, because it's really not about doing like a bed rest thing where you're not, and depending on the severeness of your injury you might need to, but it's really not about seizing all movement. It's just about understanding, where could I be at risk. It's about taking better decisions. So if let's say just hypothetically this person has a damaged ACL, movements that involve forward translation of the tibia are going to be compromised. And if you think about it, what movements are these? These are walking, running, I would say landing from a jump. Let's say you're jumping down from somewhere, right? That's going to be problematic, and we'll understand how, right? And it's the same answer everywhere. It's the forward translation of tibia in different capacities. Movements such as, pivoting in sports. Let's say you're just running, sprinting somewhere. Sprinting is another thing that's going to be very hurtful. Squats are going to be very difficult for this injury, this kind of a presentation. Now, what do all of these movement, if you try to visualize it, what do all of these movement involve? All of these movement involves a forward translation of the tibia, right? And since our ACL is damaged, it's going to be overworked, or it might be at risk. We might be putting it at a vulnerable position. In all of these scenarios, though, the way in which the ACL gets stressed, or in which that, whatever tissues are supporting or enabling or resisting that movement, that forward translation of tibia movement, whatever muscles are involved, the kind of load or the kind of stress that gets put on these muscles is going to be different in the way, and it's going to depend on what kind of movement it really is. Just as an example, simply jogging and sprinting is going to be very different, because in sprinting, first of all, sprinting is all about mechanical feedback, right? The faster that you run, the harder it becomes. Why? Because you're just pushing off against an immovable surface. That's the ground. You're sprinting against the ground, so the ground is not budging. If you are running fast, if your speed increases, it's your muscular force that's increasing. So the harder that you try, the faster you go, and the faster that you go, the harder you have to work, right? And sprints, first of all, that's why sprinting is going to be difficult, because it's just more muscular force, and it does involve forward translation of the tibia. and that's happening while you are generating a lot of muscular force. So that's going to be much difficult than, let's say, something like walking or jogging. Which, how is that different? Because walking and jogging, there's less mechanical feedback. You're not really pushing hard against the ground, you're just walking. It does still involve the forward translation of tibia. It's just that the intensity of the stimulus is much lower in this case, right? Another way in which sprinting is going to be typically difficult than walking or jogging is because it involves aggressively for positive shin angles. So typically in sprinting, the degree of the range of motion through which the tibia translates forward, it's much higher than in walking and jogging. Just visualize it. Walking and jogging, you're just going like this. Sprinting, it's this, right? So it's a combination of both. It's a combination of just heavy forces that the soft tissues around the knee have to, the damaged soft tissues around the knee have to sustain, and it's the aggressive shin angles, right? It's a much bigger range of motion than walking or jogging. So that's why sprinting is going to be difficult. So that way, although it's the same fundamental issue that since the ACL is damaged, both of these movements are compromised, but they are going to be variably difficult, right? Walking and jogging not so much, sprinting probably a lot. So you need to know these things so that you know what to avoid, what not to avoid, and then you got to connect all of it to where you are at right now, right? What's the extent of your own injury? We'll talk about that, but so yeah, these are the movements that are going to be compromised. Now another thing that involves aggressively forward shin angles, positive shin angles, or a forward translation of tibia, along with really, really, really heavy forces going through these compromised soft tissues and these joints going through the knee, is going to be if you're landing somewhere from a lot of impact, with a lot of impact. So if you're landing from a huge height, or you're landing with a lot of impact or with a lot of weight on top of you, right? That's going to present as typically difficult, because again, same aggressively forward shin angles, and another thing is heavy load that it has to resist, right? We are trying to prevent the forward shin angle, right? That's what we are trying to oppose with the ACL. And if you land really fast or from a really high platform, right, if you jump down a really, let's say, tall distance, I don't know, or if you squat down with a heavy load or jump down with a really heavy load, anything that puts more load on this forward translation of tibia is going to present as typically difficult. Now, what exercise should you avoid and what should you not avoid, right? This depends. So the same activities that are going to limit you, that you probably should be avoiding, are also the activities where you need to get stronger, right? That makes sense. And now what do you, so this is where you need to assess. This is where assessment has to happen. You need to test. First of all, you'll obviously have history about, let's say hypothetically there's an injury, you'll obviously have history about what was the mechanical fashion of the injury, how did the injury occur, how did it happen, how did it play out, right? If we clearly know that this is how it happened, then obviously that is going to be a movement that where you will be limited, which you probably might not be able to do, to that same extent where that injury happened, right? So we have a limit, we have formed a limit in a movement, we can't go there yet. So that's where we start the regressions. We start regressing it down to a point for that specific movement where we can get in, where the body is able to do something, right? Use that ACL in that proper this thing. So, and that's where you see very basic level exercises where people just lie. Would it be supinated or pronated? People lie pronated, so people lie on their bellies and they're just going to lift their knees, flex their knees off the ground behind them, and there's going to be a very light resistance and it comes back. And initially, there probably might not even be any resistance. You just might need to do that movement, right? You just might need to do that movement where you're flexing the knee. That's where you see these exercises when the person is not even able to, we find that this is what we are able to do. Let's say then, you start. First of all, you go on the historical data, right? How did the injury happen? So you definitely know what to avoid and where to start regressing down to something that where we can get in and start getting stronger, start building back up. Because that's what you do. That's what you do in a rehab process. You find the limit, regress it down to a point where you can do it, and then you start building it back to a point where you probably and hopefully progress from the point where that first limit was created, where that first injury occurred. and and another thing you do is, you obviously, now we know, if we fundamentally understand what is the function, what role does the injured, whatever it is injured, you can apply this anywhere, right? Whatever is injured, what role does it play, right? That will basically lead you to where you are limited. So now you understand, if you have an injured ACL, you definitely cannot be doing activity. You probably cannot be doing activities where you're jumping down from a huge height. You need to be avoiding the forward translation of tibia and heavy loads along with that, or in really intense stimulus, such as, heavy load can be a lot of load stacked on top of you and you're stuck squatting down. That's a lot of heavy load on the forward translation of tibia. But an intense load on the tibia can also be if you're jumping down from a huge height, where you're not really, the nature of the resistance is not really that it's loaded on top of you, there's external load on top of you, but you are coming down with a certain force, right? You're traveling a certain distance and you have your body mass, so you are going to land on that surface, and you are going to the impact is going to cause a certain amount of force going through those structures. So that's an intense stimulus as well. So these are things you need to be avoiding. And you need to be avoiding where you got injured, that movement. So these are things you need to be testing, what can I do, right? And when you actually go out and test, and it's always beneficial to just start from the basics and just build up and see what you can do, instead of testing out the hard things first and then learning the hard way, and then regressing down to something that you know probably can do, because you do not want to be putting yourself in that vulnerable position. So find something that you can do, find your limits, avoid the limits, and wherever you find you're limited, whatever movement, let's say walking is okay, doesn't hurt, going down a flight of stairs is hurting. See, this is not just about athletes, this is about normal daily average people as well. Anybody can have an ACL injury, and they will be limited in certain movements. One of these movements will be that you'll have a tough time walking down a flight of stairs. And why is that? That's because this involves an aggressive forward shin angle, right? Your tibia is translating forward. And now we know that fundamentally, if the ACL is compromised, the anterior translation of the shin is going to be compromised. So coming down a flight of stairs is going to present as typically difficult in this case. So learning about ACLs and what they do, and if you do get injured, how do you find your way around it? It's not just for athletes, it's for anybody. You have a soft tissue, that soft tissue might get compromised at some point. You need to know how to find your way back to a point where it's not compromised and where it's not limiting you, because this is a very common thing with injuries. Once that limit is created for us, and if we are never, and we are seldom, we are rarely ever able to find our way back to a point where we go across those limits where those injuries occurred, right? We just succumb to the injuries, we succumb to the reality of, okay, this is where the limit exists, and we never go and assess that. But that's completely fine. More than anything, that's just because of the lack of awareness. That's just because of we do not have a framework for looking at these things. That's why, and wherever we do not understand something properly, those are the things that scare us. Those are the vagueness is what scares us. Ambiguity, chaos around something is what scares us, right? And how do you bring order to these things? You create frameworks with which you can approach these things. So if it's an ACL injury, understand what an ACL does. So those movements are going to be compromised. Take history, take notes from what was the nature of the injury that occurred, right? Or if you do not know that, then you just say, okay, I do not know that. Then strengthen the muscles, find the limits, regress it down to a point where you can get in, and that's where you start getting stronger. Another thing that I did want to touch upon is that it's not just the ACL that's holding the integrity of the knee, right? In these movements, you got to think that there are other soft tissues as well. You've got muscles. What are the muscles that are opposing the forward translation of tibia? What would, let's say, keep the tibia from going out of the normal range of motion and just popping out? What other muscles are supporting this, right? Holding this integrity. So it'll be quads, because wherever your tibia is going forward, let's say you've got a leg, and I start bending this leg forward, which is what happens whenever you're running, whenever you're jogging, landing, right? That's what's happening. You're bending at the knee. We call this knee flexion. So you're bending at the knee. What opposes knee flexion? It's the quads, right? The quads which probably that start like at your hip and connect to your knee, these are the muscles that lengthen whenever your knee is bending, right? So just imagine your knee bending, you feel a stretch at your quads, right? That's your quads lengthening. Now muscles exist at a certain range of length, so if a muscle has lengthened, it will obviously come back to its original resting length, right? So whenever your tibia is translating forward, whenever you're bending your knee, the cord is lengthening, and if the cord has lengthened, it has to shorten as well. You have to come up again as well. If the knee has flexed, it has to extend as well. So whatever extends the knee, these muscles are going to basically support the integrity of a damaged knee that has a damaged ACL, right? Because these are the muscles that support what ACL supports. It antagonizes the forward translation of tibia. It extends your knee back. So, or it maintains the integrity of the knee rather when it is in a bent position, when there's load on that particular movement, right? Load on forward translation of tibia. This is whenever you're sprinting, whenever you're jogging, walking, coming down a flight of stairs, landing, jumping, typically these activities. So now that we know that these are the muscles that are going to support the integrity, right, of integrity of a scenario that's a little vulnerable, then these are the muscles that you strengthen, you work on. That's why you get a lot of quad exercises for whenever you've injured your ACL. You get a lot of calf exercises, right? You get a lot of hamstring exercises. You'll see bridges being done. So that's why these things are done, because these stronger calves, stronger hamstrings, stronger quads, all of which are extensors of the knee in some capacity, all of which will maintain the integrity of a knee along with the ACL when the tibia is translating forward and handling load. Strengthening these muscles up is where you guys will find your solution, if that makes sense. So this is how you reduce down ACL injuries. I hope this gave you some clarity around what ACLs are all about and what framework do you need to approach ACL injuries with, right? We see ACL injuries pop up everywhere. It's such a common injury, especially in football, right? Any game you might see somebody blow their knees out, right? Another thing that it does is it has some function in the rotation of the knee as well. But more than giving you guys exact specific knowledge about what to know about ACL, this was about how to approach anything, right? Any injuries. You understand what the nature of the thing that you're looking at is. You break it down to the fundamentals. What do you need to know to start building a solution? You need to know what the exact problem is, right? So you break it down to its fundamentals objectively. You look at things objectively, start building up a solution, do the solution, do iteration, so that when you do it the first time, you're going to get some feedback. You put it back into the process, you start building your iterations, trial and error your way forward, and that's how you make progress. That's how you get out of injuries, right? It might feel chaotic, it might feel a little you know might feel a little overwhelming when you get injured, but if you have frameworks with which you can approach injuries, if you not just injuries, it's about getting stronger as well. It's about any fitness process, any journey, right? If you have a framework, work with physiotherapists, work with medical professionals that can give you frameworks, right? Work on building up your awareness around these things. This video is not just for fitness professionals, it's for athletes as well. It's for people, whoever is interested in understanding how to reduce these problems down to a point where they do not feel overwhelming, but they feel like a challenge that you can solve, right? So that was a little about ACLs, and a lot about how you can use frameworks and how you can use first principles to reduce everything down to its fundamentals and build a solution, right? And this is how you get to escape all the hearsay, all the misinformation, and everything that seems to be a prevalent problem, especially in the health and fitness industry, right? I realized I am in the journey of realizing that I can either sit and keep criticizing and keep correcting where everyone else is going wrong, or you can work, you can produce things where you are generating the order that you say is lacking everywhere else. So work on generating that order instead of just observing and critiquing the chaos. That's the frame of thought that I'm coming with, going with these days. So yeah, few days ago I was at a point where I was like, all that I will now do is I will just keep criticizing wherever I see misinformation. Just because I know a little bit more about a few things than someone might not know, I'll just start bashing on them. I know that's really not the answer, because if you objectively look at this thing, right, if I start applying this to this thought, this dilemma that I had, then it doesn't make sense, right? I cannot, if I find something to be chaotic, right? If I find something to be overwhelming, trouble, then you do not. Quick interruption. So then you do not, you always have a choice. You can either sit and observe the chaos, critique the chaos, worry about the chaos, or you can do something to build order, right? And this video was all about how to build a framework through which you can look at injuries or anything that's movement related, right? This has application in how to build strength as well, how to, let's say there's something that you want to do that you cannot do, right? It's the same kind of pattern there as well. You find the limit, you regress it down to a point where you can do, see what else, you know what is involved, really involved in that movement, what kind of load are you talking about, what kind of stimulus you're talking about. Break down all these fundamentals, understand, do the work. It needs work, definitely not easy, needs help. Do these things, and that's how you build a solution. That's how you look at things. That's how you create order when you're staring at chaos. Hope that makes sense.